Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. Although New York City is rightly considered a melting pot of immigrants from all over the world who have settled there since the 1600s, it's not hyperbole to say that Jewish New Yorkers have had an outsized role in shaping the city into the vibrant hub of business, culture, the arts, and politics that it's been since the Dutch founded New Amsterdam. But what's been frequently overlooked is how the Jewish presence in New York has changed the trajectory of Jewish life and life in America. Joining me today is someone who spent a significant part of his career exploring the New York City Jewish community, Dr. Daniel Soyer. He's the editor of a new book, The Jewish Metropolis, New York City from the 17th to the 21st century. And he's brought together prominent experts to explain the complex history of the largest Jewish community of all time. He's also written or co-written chapters on Yiddish New York and Jews and politics in New York City. The book provides insight into New York's important contribution to the development of American Judaism and explores the ways in which immigration shaped New York's Jewish community, Jewish participation in politics, and culture of the city as a whole, and so much more. A scholar of American immigration and American Jewish history, Dr. Soyer is professor of history at Fordham University and the author, with Annie Polland, of The Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Migration, 1840 to 1920. He's also co-editor of the journal American Jewish History. Among other achievements, Dr. Soyer is the recipient of the Thomas J. Wilson Prize of Harvard University Press for the best first book manuscript, accepted in 1995. Dr. Soyer and I will speak about the Jewish metropolis and delve into the rich, complex 400-year history of New York and its Jews. Daniel, thank you for joining me today. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, to start things off, you've dubbed New York a Jewish city. How do you narrow down the topics when you prepare this book for the essays that you published in the Jewish Metropolis?
Well, I should mention, first of all, that the publisher, Academic Studies Press, came to me with this proposal that we do this book as part of their Lands and Ages of the Jewish People series. And right off the bat, it was interesting to me and impressive to me that, alongside volumes on, Germany, Canada, series editors from Canada, medieval Spain, so on. This was the only city that counted as a land of the Jewish people. So, so I said yes, I would do it. And so then the idea really is to provide both an introduction and a kind of series of interpretations of various aspects of the topic. So we wanted it to be very inclusive chronologically. So it includes essays that cover the history of New York Jews from the 17th century to the 21st century. And within that, it was a matter of just thinking about, where Jews have had an impact on the city, or where the city has had an impact on its Jewish residents or on Jewish life in general, and also kind of the diversity of Jewish life that has been lived in the city in those several centuries. So it was just a matter of figuring out various topics in culture, as you said, in politics, in economics, social life, and also thinking of people that I might like to contribute to the book. So we tried to be somewhat comprehensive, but there are many things left out of the book, and there could be easily a second volume.
Well, looking forward to the second volume, although you cover a lot of territory here. But I know, for example, you've written on the garment industry in New York, which of course is was so important to the lifeblood of New York City. And I guess you'll put that in the second volume. I want to ask you, we'll start at the beginning, really. how would you characterize the role that Jews played in New York City during the colonial period? We know a lot about Chaim Solomon. We've heard about it. But tell us a little bit more and why you really decided to start there. You didn't start at other points, 1848. You didn't start in the 1880s with the large immigration to the United States. You chose really to do it from the beginning. Tell us why.
Well, there have been Jews in New York since the 17th century. And there is a kind of quasi-semi-legendary beginning of the Jewish history of New York, which is in 1654, when a boatload of 23 really refugees from what had been Dutch Brazil, but which is now Portuguese Brazil, where the Inquisition was reestablished. So there were these refugees that arrived in New Amsterdam in 1654. This was a real event, and they did form a Jewish community. I say quasi or semi-legendary because, in fact, there were, I think, about 3 individuals who had arrived separately, before them, and actually most of them within 10 years left. The community kind of dried up and disappeared for a while. But nevertheless, that's an important moment. It's an important symbolic moment, but it's also a real moment. This was, you mentioned politics. So this was the first time I think Jews were involved in the politics of New York was when the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, tried to kick them out. And they appealed to the Dutch West India Company, which owned the colony. And Stuyvesant was told that they could stay. So this is, there are some historians who argue that, New York, in a way as we know it, which is a very cosmopolitan place, was already a very cosmopolitan place in the 17th century. The Jesuit Leo Jogues, who traveled to New Amsterdam in the mid-17th century, wrote that there were 500 men of 18 different languages already in New Amsterdam. It was a very diverse place, and so Jews were part of that mix, even when things were not always so comfortable. So this was really a logical place to start. By the turn of the 18th century, by 1700, there was a community, and which was organized and met regularly. And this is really the direct descendant of a community which still exists today in New York, Congregation Shereth Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. So if we wanted to get really the whole picture of the sweep of the history of New York, we had to start in the 17th century.
Well, fast forward to the post-revolutionary period. America is a new nation. It's trying to find its footing. Give us a sense of where New York Jews were in that particular point. What were they doing in terms of the economy? What were their professions? What were they doing that sort of was the seed, the groundwork for what became a larger community, let's say in the middle of the 19th century?
So at the time of the revolution, and for actually several decades later, there was one Jewish community in New York. There was Shereth Israel. And this was a synagogue. It was a congregation, but it really fulfilled all of the needs of the community. So all of the social welfare needs, cemetery, burial, kosher food, and so on. There was one community. Now, it was officially a Sephardic community, as it still is today. Western Sephardim, Amsterdam, London, and they looked often to those cities for guidance. There were no rabbis. There was Gershom Sasius, who was relatively learned and who was the kind of spiritual and ritual leader of the community, but he was not actually a rabbi. And so they would write back to London or to Amsterdam for rulings on various things. Interestingly enough, the majority already were Ashkenazim. But in terms of the ritual and the organization of the community, it was officially Sephardic. In terms of the broader community, Jews were very well integrated, I would say. Although there were many immigrants among them, it was mainly English speaking. They had political rights. I believe that New York was the first state already during the Revolution, 1777, the first constitution, which granted Jews equal rights, guaranteed them equal rights. They had already been, for the most part, in the already before the Revolution, voting and so on. But it guaranteed them equal rights. So they were very well integrated into the politics. There were Jews who helped to found Tammany Hall, for example, the Patriotic Society that later evolved into a notorious political machine. They were mainly merchants. They were also artisans. The example, the most famous Jew of the early republic, of course, was Mordecai Manuel Noah, who for a time was sheriff of New York. He was a politician. He was a newspaper publisher, writer. It is interesting, however, that when he became sheriff, I believe he was appointed to fill a vacancy. But when he ran for a full term, his difference did come up, right? And there were people who said that there shouldn't be a Jew as sheriff, because the sheriff also was in charge of hanging people, criminals, to which he responded, people said a Jew shouldn't be hanging Christians. So his response was, find Christians who need hanging. So he didn't, I believe he did not win that election, but he was, very active in New York politics.
What about anti-Semitism in this period? How did it manifest itself?
Well, I think I mentioned one instance that when his opponents felt that Noah was, overreaching, or simply that they wanted to, they wanted the position. They did bring up his difference, that he was a Jew and that wasn't something different. But I would say that, in this period, Jews were a very small percentage of the population. They were not particularly visible as such. Even Noah, by the way, although he was very active in politics, was not active as a Jew, right? He had a very strong Jewish identity, and he had a very strong political identity. He himself, but these things did not come, in his mind and in his presentation of himself, these things did not necessarily overlap in any significant way. So I would say at this time it's actually a little bit muted. It's not really until the middle of the 19th century that Jews become more visible. They start to be associated, let's say, with certain neighborhoods, certain businesses, and you start to see things like caricatures, that play on Jewish physical appearance or accents, or stereotypes about business practices, and so on. Right? And interestingly enough, though, this is at least one of this is some of the first manifestations of a special association of Jews with New York. Right before the middle of the 19th century, there were Jews in New York, there were Jews in Charleston, there were Jews in Philadelphia, there were Jews in Newport. There was nothing particularly special about Jews in New York. This starts to change in the middle of the 19th century.
Well, we come to the mid-19th century when our own organization, B'nai B'rith, was founded by German Jews in 1843. There are a couple of references, I think 3 references to B'nai B'rith in the book. Describe Jewish demographics in New York at that time. You're talking about neighborhoods. Where did the Jews live for the most part? B'nai B'rith was founded, we always associate the Lower East Side, at least I do and many do, with the later period of immigration and all of the things we know about the Lower East Side, Esther Street, and the popularization of that neighborhood. But actually, the founders of B'nai B'rith were on the Lower East Side. So tell us about the neighborhoods kind of mid-19th century. Where do they live?
So, all this connects to the general history of New York. Of course, before that, New York was fairly small. It was what they call a walking city. You could walk from one end to the other, and there wasn't as clear differentiation of neighborhoods. A rich merchant might live above or behind or next to their warehouse, right? And it might be near the docks. It's really, in the early mid to mid 19th century, when New York is growing and it starts to be harder to get from one end to the other by foot, and specific neighborhoods start to arise, and they have certain social characteristics. So one of those I should mention two neighborhoods. One was 5 Points, which was a very poor neighborhood. It was a notorious slum. Charles Dickens, when he visited, was shocked, by its appearance, by the conditions there. And there were Jews who lived there, although it was known mostly as an Irish neighborhood. There were also African Americans there, but there were also German immigrants, and there were Jewish immigrants as well. The other neighborhood was known at that time actually as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. This is, kind of 5 Points, Klein Deutschland are what later become the Lower East Side, right? So as you said about the founders of B'nai B'rith, these were, we think of these as German Jews. The truth is that German is, a little bit too specific a label for them. They came from Central Europe. They came from places under kind of very strong German cultural influence, some cases political influence. So some of them were from Posen, which is really Western Poland, but that was under control of Prussia, so I guess they're German Jews, right? They came from Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Alsace, and so on. But the official kind of, and many of them were actually Yiddish speaking, but the official cultural communal language was German. So they came with this Central European migration. They came as part of the German migration, which was the second largest immigrant group in the United States and in New York in the middle of the 19th century behind the Irish. And so many of these Jews lived in Klein Deutschland, in Little Germany. And so there was within Klein Deutschland also a kind of Jewish community, which overlapped with the general German community. Many Jews participated in the general German communal life, but they also had their own separate life. And of course, you mentioned B'nai B'rith, founded I believe, Zinsheimer's Saloon.
Zinsheimer's Cafe. Yes, we say cafe.
Yes. Other people say saloon. And this was on Essex Street, and this was in 1843. And this is very important also because this is the beginning also of different ways to be Jewish, right, in New York and the United States. Already from 1825, you start to see new congregations, right? Not just Shereth Israel, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, but there starts to be Ashkenazi congregations, and then it starts to multiply as people, from different regions and orientations start to form their congregations. But B'nai B'rith in 1843 is a fraternal organization, and they really establish a new way to be Jewish, to express your Jewishness. That instead of going to synagogue, you could go to the lodge and you could engage in fraternal ritual like the Masons, but a Jewish version, and declare your allegiance to Jewish tradition and Jewish the Jewish community and the Jewish people in a very, very non-traditional way. Right? If you wanted to, you could also go to synagogue, but you didn't have to. Right? You go to the lodge.
So for Jews, really New York offered the opportunity to redefine oneself in a way that maybe you couldn't do in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was very, very American, right? This was an era from the mid and the late 19th century. Fraternal societies were very, very big. Of course, they all still exist, the Masons, the Odd Fellows, and so on, Knights of Pythias, but much bigger, especially among men. Women to some extent, but mainly men. And this was a very American thing to do. So some Masonic lodges would accept Jews, and there were Jews in the Masons, but it's a little hazy exactly why B'nai B'rith was founded, whether there was felt that there were some anti-Semitism within the Masons, or some people say yes, no. But there's kind of a direct line from knowledge of this culture, of people who already participated in it, but also that this was just around, right? This was how you could be Jewish and American at the same time. And after B'nai B'rith come all kinds of other orders, most of which don't exist anymore. The Order B'rith Abraham, the Independent Order B'rith Abraham, the Free Sons of Israel, Kesher Shel Bazel, and so on and so forth. So this was a very, very important part, actually, of American kind of cultural life, Jewish cultural life, in the late 19th century, well into the 20th century.
There's a great chapter in the book on Yiddish and Yiddish culture. The arrival of Yiddish speakers really changed life for everyone in New York, not only, but particularly for Jews. Let's talk about Yiddish culture in terms of what we now refer to as the media. There was a very active press and newspaper community, the Yiddish theater, the poets, the writers, the cafes where Yiddish writers spent a good deal of their time. Tell us about how important Yiddish was to New York.
So Yiddish is very important to New York. First of all, this is the next wave, right, of immigration. In 1880, there were maybe 80,000 Jews in New York. This was a substantial percentage of the Jews of the United States. That's a sizable community. But by 1920, there were 1.5 million Jews in New York. And this is the greatest Jewish metropolis of all time to this day, right? And most of those people were Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire, the eastern end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Romania, so on. So Yiddish becomes a major language in New York. And New York becomes a major Yiddish cultural center in the world. Well, I co-wrote the article on Yiddish New York. My colleague Eddie Portnoy is the one who founded the American Hebrew, the magazine, said an article that said that actually more people answered on the 1920 census that Yiddish was their mother tongue than answered that English was. This is a little hard to believe, but I guess it's at least plausible. If Jews were almost a third of the population, and other people, other immigrants, Italians, Germans, still, so on, it's at least plausible. So in terms of New York as a Yiddish cultural center, this is the era in which modern Yiddish culture is born in the world. And so New York is part of it, right? New York is there from the beginning, so to speak. So especially, let's say, with Yiddish journalism, there were a lot of limitations in Russia, a lot of censorship, but in New York, it was just a matter of what the market would bear, really. And so New York pioneers Yiddish journalism. And people know about, of course, the Forward, which by 1910 was the most widely read Yiddish newspaper in the world. Very important in pioneering all kinds of features. We'll know about the advice column, the Bintel Brief, which was very successful. But even before the Forward, actually the first really successful Yiddish newspaper that lasted a long time was the Tageblatt, which was more conservative politically and orthodox in religious orientation. And it caught on really at the end of the 19th century. And the Forward only overtook it in the first decade of the 20th century. Eventually, the Tageblatt merged with the Morgen Journal, which was also orthodox and more conservative. But so this is, at one time, there were 5 Yiddish newspapers, dailies, in New York. And they had circulations which rivaled, the New York Times and all the other English language newspapers. So they were quite influential, and very important in terms of just local news and being local newspapers.
Even in the 1970s, my father was still a subscriber to Der Tag Morgen Journal. He used to get it by mail because we lived in New Hampshire, but he was a New Yorker, and he had the Yiddish paper. And you had Yiddish theater. There was a very robust theater scene in New York, the Rialto on 2nd Avenue. Tell us a bit about that.
So, also, right. So here there was, again, the ability to mount plays without censorship. There was all kinds of Yiddish theater. There was kind of the war between what they called Schund, which was kind of lowbrow art, which was very popular, catering to kind of the tastes of the masses. And there were always repeated attempts at a better Yiddish theater, an art theater. And this was, harder to get going, but certainly, especially, kind of nonprofit groups like the Volksbühne, which still exists, sponsored by the Workmen's Circle, later Artef, which was kind of the Arbeiter Theaterverband, the Workers' Theater Verband, the Federation, Alliance, were attempts to have a kind of theater which didn't have to necessarily have a big audience, but which would have an audience which would appreciate high art, And so you have everything from, translations of Shakespeare or kind of adaptations of Shakespeare. The famous phrase is übersetzt und verbessert. Shakespeare translated and improved by so-and-so, right? Made Yiddish, made Jewish with Jewish characters and so on. Everything from that to, very, very serious modernist, productions of original plays and also translations. But there were Yiddish theaters all over the place. The 2nd Avenue became the famous, center of it eventually by the 1920s. But there were Yiddish theaters in the boroughs in Brooklyn and the Bronx and so on.
There's a very interesting essay in the book that I found it very interesting. We think you talked about the Spanish and Portuguese communities, then the Central Europeans came, Ashkenazim, then they came from Eastern Europe. But many of us don't realize that there was a sizable Levantine community, the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and other places. Tell us a bit about that.
So along with, the 2.5 million Ashkenazi Jews who came from Eastern Europe between the 1880s and the 1920s, there were, and, most of whom actually settled in New York, there were also about 60,000 Sephardic Jews, many of them Ladino speakers, who came from the Balkans, from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, and many of them settled in New York as well. So, in addition to eventually, among the 2 million Jews in New York, there were maybe 30,000 of these new Sephardic immigrants and their children. These people had, did not have an easy time of it. The Yiddish-speaking Jews looked at them and said, you don't look Jewish, you don't sound Jewish, you don't speak Yiddish, you don't eat all the same foods, you have different customs. And so very often they felt very kind of marginal to the Jewish community, marginalized by the Jewish community. But they had their own organizations and institutions as well. They had their own press. They had a Judeo-Spanish or Ladino press, several newspapers. They had their own mutual aid societies, their own cultural organizations, and so on. And they did participate in the broader community. For example, when the New York Kahila, there was the attempt to form an overarching, organized Jewish community, which would have representatives from all of the subcommunities. And there was representation in the Kahila of these Sephardic immigrants as well.
And you still have today. I know that, for example, in the 90s, there was this migration of Syrian Jews who came in. And then, of course, with the Soviet Jewry immigration, you had many who came, settled in Queens from Bukhara, from Uzbekistan, and from other places. So that's not something that kind of stopped in the middle of the 20th century, but it continued on. I just want to ask about, when did Jews become really active and influential in the political life of the city?
So I think I mentioned earlier, like there were some individual Jews who played a role in politics, Mordecai Emanuel Noah being the most famous, but generally they were not Jewish politicians, right? They were Jews and they were politicians. They were Democrats, or they were Republicans, after the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s. But it was only when this mass migration came, and so you have Jewish neighborhoods. And when you have Jewish neighborhoods, you have Jewish districts. And when you have Jewish districts, the political organizations, including, for example, Tammany Hall, start to cater to that constituency. And so I would say it's really the 1890s when you start to see Jewish politicians who are there because they are Jewish politicians. They are representing the Jewish community in some way. There was a guy named Edward Eisenstein who ran for mayor in 1892. I think it was 1892. He's a Republican. He had no chance of winning, and he didn't win. But he was put forward as a Jewish politician, right? A representative of the Jewish community. Interestingly enough, he had run for other things before, I think for Congress. Before, he was a German politician. Now he was a Jewish politician. And by the 1890s, you start to see politicians like, now I'm blanking on his first name, but Goldfogel, who was a congressman who represented the Lower East Side and was put forward by Tammany Hall, Democrat, specifically because he was part of the Jewish community. Right? And you have people like Charles Solomon, who was an assemblyman known as, his real name was Charles Solomon. He was known as Silver Dollar Smith. His saloon was in the floor, and the walls were inlaid with silver dollars. It was kind of a gimmick, right? So he was, he was put forward also as a representative of the Hebrews of the district. Okay? So by the 1890s, you have some of these guys who were put forward by Tammany Hall, and the other parties also follow suit. Actually, the Republicans had Jewish leaders from the 1890s, 1900s, really into the 1930s. The leader of the Republican Party in New York was Jewish. There was first Lauterbach, then Samuel Koenig, who was an immigrant from Hungary. And it was actually within the party, which was actually where a lot of the action was, it was easier to rise in the Republican Party, right? So some Jews joined the Republican Party later on. Jacob Javits joins the Republican Party, like Fiorello LaGuardia, whose mother was Jewish but didn't consider himself Jewish and wasn't generally considered Jewish. Often they joined the Republican Party because they knew there was a limit to how far they could rise in Tammany, there was kind of what I call an emerald ceiling that was hard to break through. So there were many Jews in Tammany Hall, but some who felt that there was a limit to how far they could rise joined the Republican Party. Some kind of upper middle class, Americanized Jews joined the Republican Party because they felt it was cleaner than the Democrats. And then there were the socialists. There was a big socialist constituency in the immigrant community. And for a brief period of time in the 19-teens, and a little bit into the 20s, the Socialist Party played a real role in the Jewish districts in New York. One socialist congressman from the Lower East Side, Meyer London, and a number of socialist members of what was then the Board of Aldermen in New York City and the state legislature as well. And one municipal judge, Jacob Pankin, was elected as a socialist. There was no one party for the Jews. They were divided among those three parties for a long time. But by the early 20th century, they're playing a real role in New York City politics.
And ultimately, the community produced three mayors of the city. Later on, that's kind of the culmination of all of this activity. Just one other point before we close. Another essay, which you don't really read too much about. It's in the book, and it's very important. The role that the Jewish community played in the building, literally, the building of New York, the construction industry. Tell us about that.
So this really begins, also in this mass migration period, and it begins very small time. There's some immigrants manage to accumulate a little bit of capital, and they start to see, look around and say, well, how can we, increase this capital? And New York is growing, by leaps and bounds, really from the 19th century, through the 20th century. And not only population-wise, but also infrastructure-wise. And so they start to build tenements. Actually, it begins, let's say, in the 19th century in Brownsville, which was nothing. It was farmland. And they build tenements. They build new immigrant neighborhoods in Brownsville, in East Harlem, in the Bronx. And then in the 20th century, some of them start to become, bigger operators, and they start to build, office structures in Midtown and in downtown and Midtown, and bigger apartment buildings. This is both one thing that's almost unique about New York. That's a tongue twister. Unique New York is that as people move up the social scale, it doesn't necessarily mean they buy a private house, right? That apartment living was very common all up and down the social scale. So you have the tenements where the working class and poorer people, immigrants, so on. But you also have very luxurious apartment buildings. And Jews are instrumental in building those, but also commercial real estate as well. And I should add something which is talked about a little bit in the book, but also nonprofit development in terms of, let's say, cooperative housing, which is also something that's very unusual in the country, but was actually significant in New York, that Jews through some of the unions, for example, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers, build cooperative middle-income housing projects, right, in Manhattan, in the Bronx, in Queens, in Brooklyn, and so on. And also middle-class housing, not just in the center of Manhattan, but middle-income housing in the outer boroughs as well.
Well, there's so much more really that's in the book about the impact of the community on American Judaism, and also the cultural scene in New York. There's so much there. I mean, you will have to come back. But let me ask you, what would you like readers of the Jewish Metropolis to take away from your work and that of your colleagues?
I guess I would like them to take away that Jewish life in New York has been very, very diverse. And this is true across time, right? That when you say New York Jews in the 17th century were different from New York Jews in the 19th century, different from the 20th century, and different from the 21st century. Right? And and also in any given period as well. There were political differences, there were religious differences, there were, as we talked about, ethnic differences within the Jewish community. And so really when you're talking about the Jewish community, you're talking about something spectacularly diverse, right? And then the other thing I think is to think about what it means to be a Jewish city. I say in the introduction, I don't know if all of New York was a Jewish city, right? Jews were at most a third of the population. Catholics were a majority. Okay? There were many places where Jews, dominated either in a niche in the economy, like the garment industry, or in certain neighborhoods. But there were other places where there weren't many. The waterfront, very important. The port of New York was very important to New York. But aside from one or two, gangsters here and there were not that many Jews involved in that. So to think about what it means to be a Jewish city, there are more Jews even still today. There are half as many as there were at its peak, but there are more Jews in New York than there are in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv combined. Right? But they're not a majority, right? And they interact with all the other people, and they're influenced by all the other people, and they influence the other people as well. So just to think about the complications of how Jews influence the city and are influenced by the city as well.
Well, this will become an important resource for anyone who wants to know about Jewish New York and about the Jewish Metropolis. The book is, here it is, the book is The Jewish Metropolis, New York City from the 17th to the 21st Century, edited by Dr. Daniel Soyer. It's available in store or online wherever you purchase books. Dr. Soyer, thank you so much for being with us today. I've really enjoyed speaking with you about the 400-year history of New York's Jewish community. I do hope that you'll come back when the next volume appears so we can continue this conversation, because really it is a tremendous story that covers 400 years, and it goes so deep and so wide in terms of the number of important moments, not only in the history of American Jewry, but also in the history of this country, in terms of culture and the economy, publishing, and so forth. So we'll do this again the next time, but we appreciate very much your being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Well, our thanks to Dr. Daniel Soyer for joining me today and speaking about the diversity of the Jewish experience in New York. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you've enjoyed this conversation, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.